Your mortgage rate is around 6.5% right now, and it wasn't chosen by your bank or by the Fed. It came from a market most Americans have never looked at once in their lives, a $145 trillion machine that quietly prices your mortgage, your car loan, your job security, and your retirement account. In 2022, that machine caused the safe part of millions of retirement portfolios to lose about 16% in a single year. Most people who own bonds don't actually understand how they work. By the end of this video, you will, and you'll know exactly what every move in the bond market costs you in dollars. A bond is a loan. Someone needs money. A government, a company, a city. And instead of going to a bank, they borrow it from investors. You hand over a fixed amount, called the principal. They promise two things in return: a fixed interest payment every year, called the coupon, and your principal back on a specific date, called the maturity. That is the entire instrument. A piece of paper that says, lend me money now, I'll pay you interest every year, and I'll give you the principal back on this date. Bonds are not complicated. What makes them powerful is the scale at which they operate. The United States government borrows more than anyone else on Earth. As of last month, the total national debt sits at $39.2 trillion. That number is so large it loses meaning, so consider this instead. The interest payment alone, not the debt itself, just the interest, is roughly $1.05 trillion a year. That works out to about $2.88 billion every single day. The government spends more on interest than it does on national defense. This matters because every dollar of government interest is paid out of your taxes, and the rate it pays is set by the same market that prices your mortgage. There is exactly one rule you need to understand to make sense of the rest of this video. When interest rates rise, the price of existing bonds falls. When rates fall, the price of existing bonds rises. The two move in opposite directions every time without exception. Here is why. Suppose you buy a $1,000 bond paying 3%. That bond pays you $30 a year. A few months later, the government issues new bonds at 5%. Those new bonds pay $50 a year for the same $1,000. Now you want to sell your bond. Nobody will pay $1,000 for it because they can buy a new one paying more. The only way to sell it is to drop the price until the $30 it pays works out to a competitive yield. At 5%, that price is about $600. You haven't lost any future payments. The bond still pays $30 a year and returns $1,000 at maturity. But on paper, your $1,000 investment is now worth $600. Every disaster in the rest of this video is that rule operating at a larger scale. Of all the bonds in that $145 trillion market, one matters more than the others. It is the 10-year U.S. Treasury, currently yielding 4.5%. When a bank decides what mortgage rate to offer you, it does not invent the number. It looks at the 10-year Treasury and asks one question: why would I lend money to a household for 30 years when I could lend it to the U.S. government for 10 years, risk-free, at 4.5%? The answer is, it wouldn't, unless you pay more. So the bank takes the 10-year yield and adds roughly 2 percentage points to compensate for the extra risk that you, a regular person, might lose your job, get sick, or default. Right now, the 10-year is at 4.5%. Add roughly 2 points, and the national average 30-year fixed mortgage rate is 6.52%. The math is that direct. Consider Brian. Brian is buying a house. He needs a $400,000 30-year fixed mortgage. At today's rate of 6.52%, his monthly principal and interest payment is $2,534. Now imagine the 10-year Treasury rises by half a percentage point, a routine move that the bond market completes in a single trading week. Brian's mortgage rate rises by roughly the same amount to 7.02%. His new monthly payment is $2,667. That is $133 more every month for the next 360 months. Over the life of the loan, that half-point move costs Brian $47,898. If the 10-year moves up by a full point, also routine, Brian's mortgage rate climbs to 7.52%. His monthly payment becomes $2,802, which is $269 more every month. Over 30 years, that 1 point move in a bond yield Brian has never bought in a market he has never visited costs him $96,769. To see how much power the bond market has over Brian's life, run his $400,000 loan through two different historical rates. In January 2021, the 30-year fixed mortgage hit an all-time low of 2.65%. At that rate, Brian's monthly payment would have been $1,612. In October 2023, the same rate peaked at 7.79%. At that rate, the same $400,000 loan costs Brian $2,877 a month. That is the same loan, on the same house, with the same buyer. The only thing that changed was the yield on the 10-year Treasury. The difference is $1,265 a month, or $455,349 over the life of the mortgage. The bond market handed Brian a $500,000 bill without ever sending him an invoice. For decades, the standard advice given to anyone approaching retirement was simple. As you age, move out of stocks and into bonds. Bonds are the safe part. Stocks grow your money, bonds protect it. A classic 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, was sold as the conservative, sensible default. The bond half was supposed to be the seatbelt. In 2022, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates faster than at any point in 40 years. The federal funds rate went from near zero to over 4% in 9 months. Apply the rule from Act 1. When rates rise, existing bond prices fall. The broad U.S. bond market, measured by the Bloomberg U.S. Aggregate Bond Index, lost 13.0% that year. The worst calendar year in the index's history, going back to 1976. The S&P 500 fell 18.1% the same year. A 60-40 portfolio of U.S. stocks and bonds, the supposed conservative default, lost about 16% in 2022. The seatbelt did not catch anyone. It was attached to the same crash. The further out on the maturity curve a bond sat, the worse the loss. Intermediate-term Treasury bonds, the kind held in most retirement target date funds, lost 10.6% in 2022, the biggest decline since at least 1926. Long-dated zero-coupon Treasury bonds, the longest duration safe assets on Earth, lost 39.2%. To put that in perspective, a Santa Clara University analysis of historical asset returns found that 2022 was the worst year for long-duration U.S. bonds going back to 1754. Not 1954, 1754. The United States did not exist yet. There were 13 colonies, and the safe sleeve of America's retirement portfolios was having its worst year in 268 years. There is a single number that explains why some bond funds got hit so much harder than others. It is called duration, and it is printed on every bond fund's fact sheet, where most investors never look at it. Duration is a rough estimate of how much a fund will lose for every 1 percentage point rise in interest rates. Consider a retiree with $500,000 in what she believes is a safe bond fund. If her fund has a duration of 6, typical for a broad bond index fund, a 1-point rise in rates costs her $30,000. If her fund has a duration of 17, typical for a long-dated Treasury fund, that same 1-point rise costs her $85,000. Same retiree, same $500,000, same rate move, $55,000 difference. Most people who own bond funds have no idea what their duration is. They were told bonds are safe and stopped reading. Duration is the difference between a small bruise and a broken leg. One detail bit millions of retirees in 2022. If you buy an individual bond and hold it to maturity, the price drops along the way, mean nothing. You collect every coupon and you get your principal back at the end. You can ignore the rule from Act 1 entirely. A bond fund is different. A bond fund never matures. It is a basket of bonds that gets repriced every single day. When rates rise, the losses on that basket show up on your statement, and they stay there. The 2022 losses we just discussed are real, and they did not go away when the year ended. Government bonds are considered the safest borrower in the world because